evening, everyone, and welcome to this special webinar today, organized by the Coup Policy Institute, which is a think tank at the Denis and Lenora Foretia Foundation. Today, we have this wonderful session moderated by Dr. Denis Foretia, who is co-chair of the Foretia Foundation and executive chairman of the Coup Policy Institute. And today we are going to having our wonderful panelists discuss on the theme defending democracy and freedom in Africa, strong men and closing up of civic spaces. Hello to you, Dr. Foretia, and it's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you very much, Ansel, and thank you to everyone joining us from various platforms. Thanks for our wonderful guests who are joining us from across the world. It is indeed my pleasure to be hosting you today on a very important topic on democracy, the state of democracy in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, over the past 15 years, the world has seen a notable trend with democracy in retreat. This trend particularly seems noticeable in Sub-Saharan Africa. Just a few days ago, the president of Chad died on the war front, and we have seen that the constitutional provisions in Chad have been completely sidelined, and his son has been placed as the next or the interim leader of Chad. Freedom House, whom we are happy today to have one of the authors of a recent report last year, showed that of all countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, only 8 countries, including several smaller countries or so, are ranked as free and complete democracies. Just a few years ago, in the last 4 years, we have seen a real acceleration in democratic backsliding. COVID-19 has really accelerated this, as we've seen strongmen across the continent use the pandemic as a way to further restrict civic space and entrench their role. Sub-Saharan Africa has had, over the last couple of years, significant changes to the constitution. We saw the perpetration of incumbent rule in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as in Guinea. We saw the recent coup d'etat in Mali, as well as the one, what is happening currently in Chad. We have seen conflict really across multiple countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Our own Cameroon is dealing with an armed conflict. And we see what is happening in Ethiopia, in the Central African Republic, and even in Senegal, where there are indications that President Macky Sall may be attempting to use the same playbook to extend his role. And it's under these auspices that we are gathered here today to discuss what we see across the continent as far as democracy is concerned, governance, rule of law. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome 3 experts on this topic for our conversation today. First, we have Ms. Kemi Okinyodo, who is the Executive Director of Partners West Africa Nigeria, based in Abuja. And she has over 15 years experience in the security and governance space with issues across Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Kemi. It's nice to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Our next panelist is Mr. John Temin, who is currently the director of the Africa program at Freedom House, based in DC, where he oversees the organization's effort to promote democracy and good governance across the continent. He previously worked for the State Department, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and was intricately involved with engagements in South Sudan, as well as the reconciliation process in South Sudan. Thanks, John, for joining us today. And lastly, but certainly not the least, we have our very own Mr. Francis Tazocha, who is the director of the Peace and Security Program at CAFU. Francis has over 2 decades experience across the continent with engagements in Somalia and South Africa. And so Francis, is indeed our pleasure having you on this panel today. Now, Kemi, let me start with you. In a few words, what is your global view of democracy governance across the continent today?
like you said, past couple of months has seen us somersaulting, I would say, somersaulting in between conflicts, in between elections that have been tainted with violence and insecurity. You see us in the pool of multiple skirmishes of conflicts across the continent. And then you see the older generation or those that have been in power trying to perpetuate themselves in power. I tell colleagues on this side of the divide that it seems like democratic governance is seen like traditional stools that you do not give up until you die. And when you do leave, and when you do die, you pass it on to your children, just as we've seen in Chad. You see a system that is not inclusive, and I'll round up there, that is not inclusive of women and young people. So the same set of people that have been there for about 30 donkey years still continue to be there and manipulating the democratic system to ensure that they still continue to be in power. Thank you.
Well, I think the strongman rule is really is really still strong across many countries on the continent. Now, John, let me turn to you a little bit. You were and your team was part of the annual report that Freedom House puts out. And in a few, minutes, can you give us a brief overview of, where we stand, per the report on Africa today?
Sure, and thanks very much for having me, Dennis. And it's great to be alongside very distinguished colleagues. The first thing I'll say is that the trends we're talking about are really global. It's not just Africa that is deeply affected. And so in the Freedom in the World report that Freedom House produces every year, we documented the 15th consecutive year of global democratic decline and decline in freedoms. And by that, we mean that for 15 straight years, more countries have gone down in our ratings than have gone up. And so that's of great concern globally. And I'll note too that the United States has shown a lot of concerns about democratic governance these last few years. But in Africa, the picture is also a difficult one. This last year, for the report covering calendar year 2020, we had 21 countries that declined in our ratings and only 7 countries improved. And that gap of 14 between the 21 and the 7 is actually the largest gap we've had over the 15 years of global decline. So that's especially concerning. Some of the countries in particular that we're seeing backsliding on democracy are found in West Africa. And of course, West Africa has been a relatively strong performer for quite some time in terms of democracy and governance. But in recent years, there's been that backsliding. You identified some of the cases, Dennis, in terms of a coup in Mali, term limit violations in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire. I'll note some real dramatic backsliding in Benin as well and other countries. And in general, we're also seeing a lot of backsliding in countries that we categorize as partly free. We have these 3 different categories: free, partly free, and not free. And we're seeing a lot of that backsliding, especially in the partly free countries, countries that have improved to some extent and done okay, but now the democratic foundations are weakening in those places. But let me just finish too by saying that it's not all gloom and doom, and it is the negative stuff that does get a lot of attention. There are some positive stories that really do deserve attention as well. Just this last year, you look at continued progress in Sudan in their transition after a remarkable revolution. That progress is tenuous, but there are undoubtedly more freedoms that people enjoy there compared to just a few years ago. And you look at the story of Malawi, which had a really remarkable turnaround last year. Some deeply flawed elections, a lot of protests. The Supreme Court came in and called for a rerun of the elections, and that was a much better process that brought an opposition leader into power. So worth noting those encouraging developments as well.
Yeah, I think, as you said, not all, gloom and doom, but at the same time, much more gloom than, bright side. Francis, similarly, what is your general picture of where we stand today, especially from where you sit?
Thank you very much, Doctor. I will look at the case of democracy in Africa from a different lens. We will note that democracy had existed in Africa before colonization. Africa had cherished democracy. Great empires, state, kingdom had actually had governance structures, and people's representatives had also been put in place. There had been strong defense under these rulers who actually ruled these kingdoms in Africa before colonization. The democratic structures were carefully put in place, where we had representatives from different areas, from different villages, from different waters, who actually represented people in airing their views with regards to what they had to put in place before development and peace, security could reign in Africa. That's why empires like the Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, and so on existed and were very formidable during those days. The democratic structure actually, as I said, were put in place, and that is why they were very strong and could stand the test of time during that era. African had just had their own model of democracy, which was a configuration of governance modeled by the general values that include the nuances of given culture, where decision-making was.
I hope we have a better audio going forward, but I think I gleaned from what you were trying to say, Francis, that there were some governance, obviously systems of governance in sub-Saharan Africa prior to colonization, and now Africa is struggling to merge the two and how to implement democracy as currently configured across the world and currently being propagated. But John, let's dive a little bit deeper on using, for example, the issues that are currently hot with Chad. This wasn't planned, but at least in Chad, as far as what we know today, President Deby is dead, and we have a constitutional, I don't know what, military council that has been put in place with his son in charge. What is your read of this, and what do you, how do you look at the country, the immediate, short-term challenges that Chad is likely to face?
Well, I think it has a lot of characteristics of a coup. I think the world is probably going to get closer to calling it that. The circumstances of his actual death seem still to be murky, but what is clear is that the rules set out in the Constitution for succession in an instance like this are not being followed. And there's clearly a plan for handing leadership, I believe, to the head of the National Assembly and then for elections within 90 days. And all that has been swept aside by the military and them installing the former president's son in office. One additional aspect of this that is going to get a lot of attention is how Chad is situated within the broader fight against extremism in the Sahel and the partnerships that Chad has had with the region, with the international community for some time. Under Deby, Chad was seen as somewhat of a linchpin in terms of regional security and a really appreciated partner, in part because of its military prowess. And I think that was always unfortunate in some ways because it marginalized a lot of really important democracy and human rights issues. And so one thing I'll be looking for is whether those relationships continue. It was notable that France, in their reaction to the president's death, was very laudatory of him and appreciative of him. But my hope is that this perhaps presents an opportunity to revisit some of those relationships and to reconsider the nature of the Chadian state, especially now that the leadership has so clearly violated the terms of the Constitution and chosen their own path forward.
Well, John, just to push a little bit, I know, as you alluded to, the French statement and the message from the foreign minister and the presidency has been in support, tacitly endorsing the coup. And the State Department has called for constitutional norms to be respected. Do you envisage the Biden administration staying fast and pushing for constitutional the respect of the Constitution? If they are calling it for Myanmar, it would be logical to have them, for them to continue to uphold that.
I think the administration likely will continue to push for adhering to the Constitution, but what's really important here is the language that's used, because there's legislation in the United States that says if there is a coup, then automatically some forms of assistance need to be suspended. And so whether the administration officially calls this a coup has real meaning beyond the symbolism. And so that's something that I'll be looking for. I don't believe that that's happened yet, but I'm sure that there are people and lawyers who are looking at what kind of terminology to use for this, given the consequences of that terminology. And that's something that Congress, having written that legislation concerning coups, is going to be paying a lot of attention to.
Yes. Now, Kemi, you have great experience with security issues, democracy issues, and regarding the Chadian situation that we have on hand. What is your general view as to how things should or may pan out?
Well, I think for us here on this side of the divide, particularly in Nigeria, the concern is with the Lake Chad Basin axis and the insurgency and the challenge we've had over there for a while. And the fact that I think with the advent of this present administration, there had been opportunities to coordinate with our neighbors on military and security response in addressing these issues. So if we look at it, without being a prophet of doom, if we look at what happened in Libya, and the death of Gaddafi and how it was difficult to coordinate the state and non-state actors within that space, and the impact it had on us here, which we still continue to face. I think that will be an area of challenge and of concern for us, to see that there is adequate leadership that can hold the security, both state and non-state, together, so that there can be continued progress at the theater of operations in respect of the insurgency over there. And, with the fact that our borders are very porous and the people move across fluidly, it also amplifies the insecurity challenges and the expectation from us here. I think that I would say expectation from us is to have things put together as quickly as possible and have a leadership that would be able to contain the situation and would also be open to dialogue and engagement that has already been initiated, so that we can move forward and address the insurgency challenges we have on that axis. Thank you.
Thanks, Kemi. And, Francis, I hope our audio is better this time. But, Chad is in a difficult Central Africa region. And I'll just leave it at that, a very difficult Central Africa region. How do you see the situation in Chad affecting the CEMAC region?
Yes. Chad actually is a very strategic country in the Central African sub-region, that is the CEMAC region. Not only in the CEMAC region, but even in West Africa. Chad had been like a kind of a buffer zone or a bulwark that had been trying to prevent the insurgencies from Northern Africa. Remember, with the anarchy that was set loose in Libya, there had been a lot of infiltration of terrorists from that part of the world into the sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the Sahel region. So if you can take into, if you can remember how Chad had played a very important role in trying to kick away the Boko Haram, which actually had been setting the Central African sub-region or the Sahel region into confusion, had been so enormous. So with what is happening in Chad, the Central African sub-region and West Africa in general is actually in dire danger, because with that bulwark, without bulwark that actually has been destroyed, then the Central African sub-region, West Africa is actually in trouble. Remember that Central Africa itself, the Central African Republic is also in crisis. In Cameroon, there are also insurgencies, or not as well insurgencies, but the conflict in the Anglophone region has also put Cameroon also in a kind of a situation where if things are not put in place immediately, then there is going to be stabilization in the Central African sub-region, which actually is a very important hope, maybe for trade and sustainable development in that part of Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's obviously one of those crises that one is going to watch very closely. Now, if we go to the the general discussion regarding the way elections have been configured or accepted in many African countries today, John, there is the whole thinking, many Africans will argue, that democracy has been relegated to an exercise of electioneering that is passed for representing the democratic views and aspirations of the citizens or so. Now, what is your view on the whole notion of elections and elections, the way it's conducted in Africa, and where are some of the areas where there can be some improvements?
Well, it's a good question, and part of your premise that elections are only one piece of democracy is absolutely correct, and there is a tendency to overvalue elections as if they are almost all of democracy, but that's far from the case. What matters in between elections, the daily governance, transparency, is equally, if not more important. But that said, Africa is in a really tough string of elections right now, and that accelerated last fall when you had difficult processes in Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, and the elections so far this year have been equally difficult, starting with Uganda. And you look at the calendar of elections for this year, they are almost all in countries that we at Freedom House categorize as not free and partly free. And so I think the concern is that there's going to be a real narrative around a whole series of problematic, unfree, and unfair elections. My particular concern is how that affects African perceptions of elections and whether Africans continue to believe that elections are a vehicle for change and are a vehicle for removing from office leaders who are not serving their interests and may be ineffective. And there's actually some data from the great folks at Afrobarometer that shows, in fact, that Africans' belief in elections as a vehicle for change is reducing compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And that's where I really start to get concerned, because then citizens are forced to look at other options in order to express their will, in order to change leaders. And maybe sometimes that's necessary, but those other options can often be risky and sometimes violent, and the better choice is for elections if there is a free and fair environment. And right now it's harder to find that free and fair environment in too many countries.
I couldn't agree more with you on that. Kemi, Nigeria is in a peculiar place. Now, since 1999, there has been regular elections, in Nigeria. And there was the time when there was the flirtations, I think, by former President Obasanjo for a third term, and things like that. But on the way we see from outside is that every 4 years or so, there seems to be this dance that happens and somebody, comes out. What is your view of not just elections in Nigeria, but, continentally, and where do we have opportunities?
Thanks, Dennis. Just like you said, the issue of tenure extension, is one we continue to grapple with across the continent. And when we talk of elections and we think, okay, this is all it takes, then for some of us that work within the sector, we ask, post the election, what happens? Post being sworn in, we're having challenges with accountability. Transparency, accountability is not at its best or where it ought to be. We're seeing challenges with shrinking of, I'll say, governance or democratic space. So there is the resistance to opposing voice or opposing views, either from another political party or from civil society or from the media. Then you also are seeing a system whereby inclusivity in the governance system. So when you look at this whole spectrum, how are young people participating? Are their voices being heard? Are they being allowed to share their views or engage within the system in a legitimate way without having to take to the streets? Because I would say, because the participatory space is not broad enough and it's not engaging enough, that's why we continue to see some form of protest being led organically by young people so as to put their issues on the front burner. We continue to see evolution of non-state actors, some at the community-based level, some being endorsed by states. So we now are seeing, at least in Nigeria, we're seeing more of regional security outfits being put together by state governors. It says a lot, because again, our federating system is not being properly negotiated. So you find so much power being concentrated at the national level, and devolution of powers to the state and then to the local government where they exist, where they seemingly they seem to be disappearing, every day. And that is the system of government that is closer to the people. So even when we talk about elections that we celebrate is at the national level and maybe at the subnational level. At the local government level, where that government is tandem to the lives of the people, it really does not exist. Thank you.
So, Kemi, let me just follow up, from what you just said of the federating system, where things are still, even in federal systems like yours, still the belief that the central government, the federal government, still has obese power. Let me use that one, like obese power in determining what happens at the local level or so. What are some of the civic leaders, what are some of the issues that civic leaders are engaging in to be able to help, in this devolution process?
There are multiple levels of reforms that are ongoing. And you see me, I say reforms, quote and unquote. So when we talk, one of it is the police reform agenda, which should look at devolution of powers to the state level, But then again, you would also look at, we also have constitutional reform that is ongoing within the National Assembly. Part of the challenge some of us have had with the constitutional reform agenda is that we've not been able to see any administration concluded. And it's difficult for you to see any administration concluded because multiple issues are being taken at the same time. So one would have said, okay, if with this administration, we're taking the issue of negotiating our federating system, And that's all we're going to look at. There might have been opportunity to look at it from the beginning to the end and see how it's concluded. And the effect of that would naturally be seen on other germane areas. So for example, you probably would see it with the law enforcement and security apparatus or the structure. You probably would see it with the governance structure, like I mentioned earlier. But where we're negotiating the federating system, we're taking the issue of citizenship, we're taking the issue of security architecture. You're taking so many things at the same time that it is obvious you would not conclude any. And that's what we've continued to see since the return to democracy. So I would say maybe the parliament has its heart in the right place, but the strategy is wrong. And there's none of them looking back to review the strategy, to dare to say, okay, let's change strategy so that we can have and we can make substantial progress. Another issue for us is when we talk our federating system, when you look at what does it mean to be a Nigerian, So is there an allegiance by the people to the state, or our allegiance is based on primordial tendencies, where I'm from, who is a member of my ethnic group, which church, religious basis do I belong to, which also helps to reinforce the artificiality of our borders. So you find natural allegiance across the borders rather than from the periphery to the center. And all of this, one way or the other, plays out in the challenges that we are seeing that continues to that the country continues to grapple with.
Wow, I think that's very interesting. Those challenges that you've highlighted. Now, some of the arguments that have been made regarding why things are so entrenched and why a lot of these people, when you get to power, you don't want to leave power, is because of the whole notion of, and the way a lot of our politics is played, the whole winner take all system. Right. So if somebody is to leave power today, they go from grace, and they fall over. And so there is that. Nobody wants that. I mean, for it. So there is that winner take all. And we see, Francis, where the recent election in Uganda, where Bobby Wine and the whole challenges there, the systems are rigged. We saw what happened in Benin with the so-called reformer who has reformed not in the way people were expecting him to reform, so to speak. Now, how do you situate, the winner-take-all systems that we have? With the difficulties that are there for the civic space to be broadened and for young people to have a place in the discussions about the future of their countries. I think you are muted, Francis.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. The situation in Africa is very peculiar. As I earlier said in my introduction, there has been this fossilization of traditional African democracy that existed where kings remain in place and give power to their children and so on and so forth. With that regards, what actually has been happening in Africa, especially in this particular era, is that the incumbents have always done everything to amass power onto themselves. And they try at all costs to make sure that they transcend the powers that they hold into their own children. And that takes us to that era of what I'm saying, fossilization. And because of the Western democratic tendencies that have emerged in Africa, opposition leaders actually have always been bullied at, threatened, and then kept away in such a way that they do not have any say, so that the people in power remain there and they elect those who are around them. And before the election is even taking place, they had already prepared and know the result before election, the votes are cast. So these are some of the challenges that has always made problems in the democratic process in Africa. And I've also learned to understand that The problem in Africa is not actually the democracy per se, it is the democratization process where the incumbent have always wanted to remain in power and then hand over power to their relatives or to their children and transform the modern or the contemporary democracy into a kind of a kingdom. And that has been one of the reasons why there has been a lot of conflict in Africa with regards to election.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing a great point regarding the source of conflicts, that we have. And, if we're to talk about human rights, John, the human rights situation on the continent, and a lot of the conflicts. Now, if you were to do a holistic assessment, even country by country, most of the democratic countries have conflicts that are very different from the kinds of conflicts that you see in autocratic, government. I'm not saying it's different, but it appears less ferocious, so to speak. Now, from your vantage point, how do you see the human rights situation, in the continent, as well as that juxtaposed with the conflict, situation? We're talking about the Sahel now, and we have human rights violations in many countries or so. But how do you juxtapose the two?
That's a good question. I want to briefly go back to just the last topic, if I may, in terms of leaders sticking around for a long time, to note that this is also an accountability question as well, because for some leaders, they are well aware of the abuses that have happened on their watch, and they're concerned that if they leave office, that they may be held accountable for some of those things. And so the safest thing to do is to stay in office for a long time. There's a contradiction there in that as accountability mechanisms get better in some places, whether it's the ICC or something more local, increases the pressure for leaders to stick around if they aren't going to face those mechanisms once they leave office. And every time that a former leader does face some accountability, if that's called for, as should happen, also makes it even more difficult for it to happen again in some ways. So that's a problem that I think a lot of people are grappling with. And it relates to your question concerning human rights. The observations that I made at the top in terms of what we're seeing in freedom in the world very much pertains to human rights as well, where we're seeing a difficult situation in a lot of the same countries where we're seeing democratic backsliding. And those two things happen in tandem, because without a more open democratic system, it's harder to hold leaders accountable. It's harder to publicize human rights violations. It's harder to come to the defense of human rights champions. And we're seeing those types of people marginalized in a whole lot of countries. And that does relate to the conflict situations that you're talking about. For the most part, the strong democracies in Africa do not have significant conflicts within their borders. There's a definite correlation between countries that struggle in terms of democracy and human rights and conflict and volatility. You look at some of the countries that perform the worst in our freedom in the world ratings, countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Central African Republic. These are countries that have long been beset by violent conflict, and where the state is really almost not present or is largely aggressive towards its own citizens. And again, that's also a product of lack of democracy and lack of citizen accountability to be able to, citizen ability to hold their state accountable.
And John, just to follow up a little bit, the freedoms that you're referring to, and how we have seen across the continent, the countries that have more economic freedom. Can you speak to that, like how that relates to the practice of democracy or like democratic governance?
Yeah, well, as you know, there's this long-standing debate on the correlation between economic growth and democratic freedoms, and some making the argument that it takes a strong man, it takes a strong leader to really grow an economy, and The examples that are often held up there is Rwanda and the supposed growth that's happened there, and also Ethiopia, particularly under the previous leadership of Prime Minister Meles. And we see what's sadly happening in Ethiopia right now. I think there's a lot of questions about that argument. There's a lot of questions about the data surrounding economic growth in some countries, especially Rwanda. And there's a lot of questions about where people set their priorities. And definitely some of those priorities very much have to do with economic growth. They have to do with feeding their families and having a roof over their head and so forth. But a lot of those priorities also have to do with day-to-day freedoms and ability to dress as they choose and say what they want to say and live how they want to live. And so, I think there's a constant interplay between those things. They are not necessarily at odds. They do not have to be. And really, in some of the countries where we see some of the greatest freedoms, we also see some healthy economic growth. And I think these things can be positively reinforcing each other as well.
Yeah, totally agree. Now, Kemi, we start thinking about like where do we go from here? This is there is a somber, gloomy picture regarding the state of things. There are folks there are Democrats on the continent. Although on the national stage, they're becoming fewer and fewer, if I may say so. Where do we go from here regarding a continental-led push or support from like-minded institutions or and governments in trying to sustain or rejuvenate the democratic push across sub-Saharan Africa?
I'll say maybe because of my own area of interest, activities or engagement around improving or strengthening rule of law cannot be underestimated. It's something we need to look at and not play lip service to, and look at rule of law through governance and not just look at it through the criminal justice system, but look at it broadly through governance. What does this mean? How does it play out? Inclusivity is something we cannot also underestimate or overemphasize, because you have a population, we have a heavily youth-based population, and we cannot continue to engage without bringing this population and mainstreaming their issues and giving a platform for engagement for them, either within the civil society space or even within the public space. Closely related to that is also including women in the dialogue space, in the participatory space, in the governance space, and then finally, is expansion of civic space. This system of closure of civic space, because governments are not favorable to criticism, they are not favorable to opposing ideas or comments. We need to look away, we need to move away from it. They need to be encouraged to look at opposition, civil society, media, not as enemies, but as partners in progress. Because we all want the same thing at the end of the day, I suppose, but it's the way and manner in which we want to go about it that is the challenge. So when you have everybody being able to engage in a legal and legitimate manner without clamping down by the government in authority or those that are holding powers, it allows for more robust engagement and more widening of the space.
And so, Kemi, regarding a lot of folks, very interested in the issues that Nigeria is going through, and the way Nigerian pro-democracy folks in Nigeria have fought, because there were certain instances in Nigeria's history that to me appeared very seminal, like the Supreme Court acting to talk about term limits, or even the administration, the parliament, standing up and talk about upholding certain democratic principles or so. How do we create a system that ensures that what happened, for example, in Malawi can happen in many other countries?
Well, you hear me, I'm a champion for inclusivity. I'm a champion for opposing voices and getting those opposing voices onto the table. I'm also a champion for looking at strategies for engagement, So just yesterday we were talking about women participation in politics, and some of my colleagues were putting on the table that what we have seen is a gradual decline, right? So we're seeing fewer and fewer women in elected positions in the country. Is it possible for us to go another route of having constituencies? Say, you must field a woman for this position, and it's something across board. So it's like quota, but like a positive quota system, so to say. So you're not saying 35% affirmative action, but we're saying from this constituency, you must have a woman as a local government chair. So even if all parties would now have to field women, and you could do something like that, even across board for looking at, if you look at the spectrum and look at how we want to engage. Because again, accountability, transparency, inclusivity are things that we cannot undermine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, folks, please send your questions on the chat or the Q&A button. That way we can take it as we we start looking at how we go from here. Now, Francis, a question actually that Leandre Bannon posed was, what is the role of our institutions? Our regional institutions, such as the AU, the different, like ECOWAS is used to be very strong, although it is getting weaker in my eyes, but that's just my view. What is the role of our regional institutions in this process?
Okay, thank you very much. The problem with the issue in Africa actually may not actually be more on the role of the regional organizations. I will first and foremost hold the colonial powers ransom, because they brought us into the democratic processes, and they at times support wrong decisions taken. Coup d'etats, which is military, is seen as something very bad to the Western world in some countries. And remember that if you change the constitution, it is still considered as a coup d'etat. Actually, constitutional coup d'etat, because, or civilian coup d'etat. If they had changed from, maybe the constitution says that 2 terms limit, 4 years or 5 years, when it expires, I think one has to hand it down. But when it goes, there is a way in which some of these governments do. They mutate, or they mutilate the constitution at the 3rd term, at the 4th term, and so on. And when they do that, the international communities do not say anything. They sit mute. They pretend as if nothing has happened. And it generates from one country to the other. I think this is one of the reasons why you saw what happened in Chad had happened. So we should not just, first of all, begin to blame our own institutions. We should blame the colonial masters, who actually are like, or these African countries are like puppets in their hands. If we can hear the Macron, the first person to congratulate or to, Idriss Déby, who actually ascended to power when his father died, not following the constitutional manner. What do you think, or what president do you think is going to say to other African countries? We will do the same. It may happen in Cameroon the next day, because when it happened to Chad, nothing happened. So they will have to copy those examples. That's the first thing I have to say. And then when the opposition leaders who actually have stood firm to try to promote democracy in Africa, when they are tortured, says anything. And these are some of the things where if these things actually, if they could try to address them and shout down at this, it will work. So remember that these ECOWAS, or what we call the REX, Regional African Economic Communities, actually have little or no power because they have little financial prowess, which they can stand on their own. And if they begin to oppose some of these decisions taken by the Western world, is going to turn maybe their financial sorry. And if they try to oppose them, it means that they are going to curtail their sources of funding. And that's why sometimes you find them become like two less bulldogs when they just, it happens, what they tell you is that we condemn what has taken place vehemently. I think condemnation will never change what decision has been taken. So first and foremost, if the international community has given the right of democracy or the way in which democratic processes should take place in Africa, we should respect that and respect it wholly.
Thank you very much for that, Francis. And I think you know, there are the issues of how, you know, democracy proponents are supported, because most of the time they don't carry guns when they are promoting democracy, and the guns are held by the state governments with the presidents. Now, John, as we try to like start, you know, we have 10 more minutes or so. When you look at it globally, the Trump administration, the previous Trump administration, there was the whole argument of its not necessarily promotion of autocracy, but not particularly concerned about erosion of democratic principles, you know, so to speak. And the new Biden administration is planning, or has let everyone know of its plan to convene, whether it's a summit for democracy, summit of democracy, something about, you know, democracy and around the world. And I know you've written a lot about this summit, with some ideas as to how such a summit, you know, could be held, and what potential benefits it may have in the whole process of re-establishing global norms or global democratic norms. Now, can you briefly, you know, talk about, you know, this summit for democracy and how it could, from your own judgment, or how it could be used to be able to help promote democracy in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Sure, and I don't know too much about the details of what's being planned, and I think a lot of that is still very much in the planning stages. But what I've encouraged is that civil society should really be at the center of any sort of summit of democracy. And I say that in part because, especially where we're seeing some real significant democratic backsliding, I think there are growing questions about the extent to which national leaders legitimately represent the interests of their people. And I think there are some instances in which civil society representatives can actually be more legitimate representatives of their people than leaders who may have come to power through questionable elections, or leaders who may have changed term limits in order to stay in office. And so my hope is that any sort of global conversation about democracy very much includes the voices of civil society leaders who can represent so many different interests, including interests that national leaders don't really want to elevate. And so that's, you know, that's my main pitch in terms of what the summit should look like. And I think, just like any sort of countries, civil society leaders should also make some real firm commitments at this summit that they are held to following up on after the summit, as should the countries that are participating.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. Now, as we, what is your view? I'll have a few questions. That way I can take a few questions and have you just conclude with. In your opinion, this is from Vanessa Abundi. In your opinion, what will be the geopolitical consequences of the jet of Chadian President Idriss Déby on democracy in Chad. I think we talked about that at the beginning. There is concern, this is from Lola Adekanye. There is a concerning link between corruption, weak governance, and national security. Corruption and bad governance enables terrorist groups overwhelm countries in Africa and make foreign superpowers focus more on national security risk at the expense of building democratic institutions. What do the panelists think about how to manage these priorities, national security versus democratic strengthening? I think that would be a good one for you, John, as we round up.
Well, thanks. It's a good question from Lola. You know, my view is that across U.S. administrations, and especially in the previous U.S. administration, the pendulum has swung too far in terms of national security at the expense of promoting democracy and human rights. And I think a lot of leaders in countries in insecure neighborhoods have gotten very good at playing that card of insecurity and convincing the world that it's me or chaos. And you may not like me, you may not like how I run the country, but I bring some degree of security, and I can even contribute peacekeeping troops elsewhere to bring security there too. I think any sort of argument like that really needs to be interrogated. And I think policymakers really need to take a longer term look at these things, because in the short term, maybe some of that argument is true. But in the long term, it's a very questionable argument, because those domestic practices that we don't like, those human rights abuses, those unfair elections can contribute directly to instability in the medium to long term, as can massive corruption, which is such a driver of resistance, rightfully so. You know, these things are the seeds of domestic instability, and we shouldn't overlook those things in favor of whatever short-term benefits in terms of security undemocratic leaders may bring.
Thank you, Kemi. You know, sadly we are coming. The time is short. So, what overarching themes and can you leave us with?
Just to buttress on what John has said about the national security democratic strengthening question, is to say that there cannot be an effective national security architecture without effective democratic strengthened institutions. So what you have as military or security response is a short-term response. The long-term goal to ensure that you turn the curve and move away from where you are as per insecurity is addressing most of the democratic issues, because they are the drivers of the insecurity. Because you've left them unanswered for such a long time, they have festered and have created insecurity challenges within the countries or across the continent. So attention needs to be paid to democratic strengthening if we are going to get national security right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kemi. Francis, a minute. What are your concluding? Where do you think we are, and some overarching themes? Francis, I think you are muted. Just some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I'll conclude by saying that democracy, if we take into consideration that the wind of change that blew across the Eastern Europe and came to Africa, is still somehow at its nursing state. I think it's just a matter of time, or where time should be given to African nations. They'll be able to follow maybe examples of other countries which actually have harnessed a lot of democratic principles, good governance, the rule of law, and in time to come, there will be Africa will be a continent which is actually strong in democracy. If you take, for example, a country like a de facto state like Somaliland, which actually got its independence in 1991, it has had 5 successful elections and change of presidents. and the country is growing. The economy is, advancing, even though the international community has not recognized them as a country. And a few days ago, I remember the United States Undersecretary for African Affairs was like advising Somalia to take example from Somaliland and build its country from those premises. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kemi, John, Francis, and our entire team for this wonderful discussion. It has been, we could have it for an extra hour to really do further and deep diving. Appreciate you taking this your day to spend it with us. Thanks to all who participated. These conversations happen on a weekly basis, and we look forward to having you further. But enjoy your day, and thank you once again. Thanks our team, Ansel and Santha, for putting this together, and have a good one.